I still remember the first day I stepped onto the military base. The scorching sun beat down on us as we stood in formation, our uniforms stiff and unfamiliar, our bodies already aching from hours of drills. The scent of sweat, dust, and tension hung in the air. I had always been disciplined. College had taught me how to push through exhaustion. But this was different. This was about breaking you down before building you back up. Every barked order, every relentless drill, every moment of scrutiny felt like a test. And I refused to fail. The first time I saw Sergeant Cole, he barely spared me a glance. He was everything a leader should be, commanding, confident, and dangerously composed. His uniform was always crisp, his voice a deep rumble of authority. He moved with the ease of someone who had spent years in the service, as if the military wasn't just his job, but his identity. I'd heard rumors about him, that he was one of the toughest men on base, that he pushed recruits past their limits, that he had no patience for weakness. Yet he wasn't cruel. His presence alone demanded respect, and the way he watched people, assessing, calculating, made me feel like he saw through every wall I put up. At first, I tried not to notice him too much. I wasn't stupid. The military was no place to entertain. Thoughts I'd buried for years. But something about Sergeant Cole got under my skin in a way I couldn't explain. Maybe it was the way his voice sent a shiver down my spine when he called my name, or the way he never smiled, except for the faintest smirk when he saw someone struggling and knew he was about to push them harder. Maybe it was just the sheer force of his presence. Solid, immovable, completely untouchable. Whatever it was, I told myself it was nothing. It had to be nothing. Mark. Hearing my name snapped me out of my thoughts. Sergeant Cole stood in front of me, his gaze sharp. "Yes, sir," I responded quickly, standing at attention. He studied me for a moment, then his lips pressed into a thin line. "You need extra training." My stomach twisted. I wasn't the weakest in my unit, but I also wasn't the strongest. I'd been pushing myself harder every day, determined to keep up, and yet here I was, singled out. "Yes, sir," I said, again trying to keep my disappointment out of my voice. "Meet me at the field after hours," he continued, voice firm, unreadable. "We'll work on your endurance." Then he was gone, just like that, moving on to the next recruit without a second thought. I stood frozen for a second, my pulse pounding. I had wanted to be noticed by him, but not like this. The field was almost empty by the time I arrived. The air had cooled, but my shirt still clung to my skin from the sweat of the day's training. Floodlights buzzed overhead, casting long shadows across the dirt, making everything feel eerily quiet. The rest of the recruits were probably asleep, exhausted from the brutal drills. But not me. I spotted Sergeant Cole near the edge of the field, his arms crossed over his chest, watching me approach. Even in the dim lighting, his presence was commanding. Strong. Sure, completely in control. "Right on time," he said. I stood at attention. "Yes, sir." His sharp eyes flicked over me before he gave a short nod. "Let's get started." The training was relentless. Sprint drills, push-ups, burpees, each one designed to push me to the brink of exhaustion. I forced myself to keep going, ignoring the burn in my muscles, the ache in my legs. Failure wasn't an option. Cole watched me closely, stepping in whenever my form faltered. He was hands-on, more than necessary. When I struggled with push-ups, he crouched beside me, placing a firm hand on my lower back. "Engage your core, Mark. Tighten here." His fingers pressed briefly against my skin, sending an unexpected shockwave through me. I nodded quickly, hoping he didn't notice the way my breath hitched. Later, as I sprinted across the field, he ran alongside me. "You slow down when you get tired," he observed. "Push through it." I gritted my teeth and kept moving. But then, during one of the final drills, he stepped behind me to correct my posture for squats. His hands settled on my shoulders, firm and steady. "Back straight," he murmured, his voice lower than usual. "You're putting too much strain on your knees." I swallowed hard. His body was so close, heat radiating from him, his breath barely brushing the side of my neck. I did as he said, fixing my stance, focusing on the movement. But it was getting harder to focus when his hands lingered a second too long, when his voice carried something almost unreadable beneath its usual authority. I stole a glance at him. He was watching me, not just my form, not just my effort, but something deeper, something that sent a nervous thrill through my chest. I tried to shake it off. I was reading too much into it. I had to be. But then, as the session continued, I started noticing the little things. The way his gaze flicked toward me when he thought I wasn't looking. The way his touch lasted a fraction of a second longer than necessary. The way his voice softened when he corrected me, just barely, like we weren't in training anymore. Then, there was the smirk. That damn smirk. After a particularly grueling set of lunges, I bent over, hands on my knees, trying to catch my breath. When I looked up, Cole was standing there, arms still crossed, a hint of something amused, or something else entirely, in his expression. "Tired already?" he teased. I straightened, wiping sweat from my forehead. "No, sir," I said, breathless. That smirk deepened. "Good." I turned away before I let myself think too much about it. This was dangerous. Whatever I thought I was seeing, it couldn't be real. Sergeant Cole was my superior. He was a man who lived by discipline, by rules. He couldn't. But the way he watched me, the way I felt when he was near, was making it harder to convince myself that this was all in my head. I pushed through the rest of the session, forcing myself to focus. By the time we finished, my entire body ached, but I refused to show weakness. Cole nodded approvingly. "You did better tonight." I straightened my shoulders. "Thank you, sir." For a moment, we just stood there, the silence stretching between us. Something unspoken hung in the air, thick and heavy. Then finally he broke it. "Same time tomorrow?" "Yes, sir." I turned to leave, forcing myself to walk away like my mind wasn't spinning, like my pulse wasn't racing for a reason that had nothing to do with exhaustion. And as I did, I could still feel his gaze on me. The night air was thick with humidity, wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. My muscles screamed with every movement, my breath came in ragged gasps, and sweat dripped down my back, soaking through my uniform. But I refused to stop. Sergeant Cole's voice cut through the haze of exhaustion. Again. I clenched my jaw and forced my body to move, dropping into push-ups. My arms shook violently beneath me, every muscle burning, every fiber of my being screaming for relief. "Keep going," he ordered, his voice firm but not cruel. I gritted my teeth and pushed, through 2 more, 3, until my arms buckled. My chest hit the dirt with a dull thud, and for the first time since I arrived at this base, I couldn't get back up. A sharp breath escaped me. I clenched my fists, furious at myself. Cole was silent for a moment. Then, instead of barking another order, I heard his footsteps move closer. A hand rested on my back, solid, warm. Mark. My name. Not recruit, not a clipped command, just Mark. I stayed where I was, my forehead pressed against the ground, my body trembling, not just from exhaustion, but from the overwhelming frustration bubbling inside me. I can't, I muttered, my voice strained. Cole crouched beside me. His presence was different now, no longer the untouchable sergeant, but something softer. "You've been pushing yourself harder than anyone here," he said, his voice quieter now. "And you're still standing." I let out a hollow laugh. "Barely." He exhaled through his nose, and then I felt his hand move, tracing, lightly down my spine, resting between my shoulder blades. A steady, grounding touch. "That's more than most can say," he murmured. A lump formed in my throat. I didn't know why, but the moment felt too big, too raw. Maybe it was the exhaustion. Maybe it was the way I'd been carrying too much for too long, but something inside me cracked. Before I could stop myself, the words tumbled out. "I don't know if I belong here." The confession was small, almost, lost in the night air. But Cole heard it, His fingers twitched against my back like he wanted to press harder but was holding himself back. I pushed myself up onto my elbows, chest still heaving. Everyone else seems to have something to prove, a legacy to live up to, a family to make proud. I let out a short breath. I don't. Cole didn't speak, just listened. So I kept going. My father never wanted me to enlist, said I wouldn't make it, that I wasn't strong enough. I swallowed hard. Maybe he was right. Cole let out a sharp breath. He's wrong. I turned my head slightly, looking up at him. His eyes weren't cold now. They were intense in a different way, like he was fighting something inside himself. He exhaled slowly, then said, "You remind me of myself when I first got here." I blinked. What? He glanced away, jaw tight. I was just like you, young, fighting to prove something I didn't even understand at the time. His fingers flexed against his knee. I know what it's like to wonder if you belong. Something inside me shifted at his words. The great untouchable Sergeant Cole had once been like me. I sat up fully, ignoring the way my limbs protested. What changed? He was quiet for a long time. His gaze flickered. Toward me, then away. I could see the battle behind his eyes, something just beneath the surface, something he wasn't saying. I adapted, he finally said, but his voice was lower now, strained. A part of me wanted to push, to ask what he really meant. But then his gaze locked onto mine, and the air between us shifted. It wasn't just tension anymore. It was something deeper, something that made my pulse pound in my throat. I suddenly became hyper-aware of how close we were, how the heat of his body lingered in the space between us. His fingers flexed against his knee again, like he wanted to move them, like he wanted to reach for me. I held my breath. For the first time since meeting him, I saw it. Hesitation. Cole had been so sure of everything, so unreadable. But now he was holding something back. I didn't move. Neither did he. Seconds stretched into an eternity, and then, finally, he cleared his throat and stood up, putting distance between us. "Get some rest," he said, his voice sharp again. Back to the sergeant I knew. I swallowed the lump in my throat and nodded. But as I pushed myself to my feet, my body still aching, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just in my head. He felt it too. The day had been brutal, physically, mentally, emotionally. By the time evening rolled around, my body was screaming for rest, but my mind wouldn't stop racing. Every glance Sergeant Cole had thrown my way today had been different. He wasn't just watching me, he was struggling with something. So when a message came through ordering me to his quarters, my pulse kicked up. I shouldn't have been nervous. It could have been about training, discipline, anything. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I walked through the dimly lit hallway, my boots echoing against the cold floor. My hands were clammy, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. I stopped outside his door, took a breath, knocked. "Come in." The moment I stepped inside, I felt it. The tension, the shift. His room was dimly lit, the only light coming from a desk lamp, in the corner. Cole stood near the small table, arms crossed over his chest, his posture rigid, but his eyes gave him away. He was battling something. "Close the door." I hesitated for half a second before doing as he said. The soft click of the latch felt deafening in the silence that followed. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he exhaled sharply and ran a hand down his face, like he was about to do something he'd regret. "This is a mistake," he muttered. Sharp pangs shot through my chest. Was that why I was here? Because he had changed his mind about whatever this was? I swallowed. "Sir, if this is about training—" "It's not about training," he interrupted, his voice lower now. My breath caught. He turned to me, and for the first time, he wasn't Sergeant Cole. He wasn't the untouchable leader, the man who barked orders without hesitation. He was just Cole, and he was struggling. I shouldn't have called you here, he muttered. I took a step closer before I could stop myself. Then why did you? His jaw tensed. He looked away for a second, his fingers flexing like he wanted to grip something, like he wanted to hold himself back. I don't know, he admitted. Liar. I could see it in his face. He knew exactly why. And suddenly I was so damn tired of pretending. My heart pounded as I took another step, the air between us thick enough to suffocate. Sir, don't. His voice was sharp, but his eyes weren't. He clenched his fists at his sides. This, whatever this is, we can't. I swallowed hard. I know. Silence stretched between us, charged, fragile, but I couldn't stop myself. Then why does it feel like we already have? His gaze snapped to mine, and in that moment, everything unraveled. He looked at me like I was dangerous, like he wanted to pull away and come closer at the same time. I felt lightheaded, my breath shallow. The weight of everything we weren't, saying pressed down on me, stealing the air from my lungs. I forced myself to speak. You're not the only one struggling with this, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. His expression flickered, guarded, but raw. I swallowed. I hesitated, but I couldn't lie. Not now. I feel it too. The words hung between us, thick and irreversible. Cole shut his eyes for half a second, as if pained. Then he took a breath, deep, slow, controlled, before stepping closer. Pulse slammed against my ribs. He reached up, fingers hovering near my jaw, but not touching. Not yet. This is wrong, he murmured, but his voice was unsteady, like he didn't believe his own words. I swallowed. Then why does it feel right? The hesitation lasted only a second. Then, finally, he closed the distance. His fingers brushed my jaw first, barely there, a tentative touch that sent a shiver down my spine. Then his hand slid to the back of my neck, his grip firm, grounding, and before I could process what was happening, his lips crashed into mine. It wasn't soft, it wasn't careful. It was a storm built from weeks of restraint and buried tension finally breaking free. My hands found his chest, gripping his shirt as I melted into him. He pulled me closer, his breath hot against my lips, like he was starving for this, for me. A low sound rumbled from his throat, a mix between frustration and relief. He tasted, like control unraveling, like a man giving in to something bigger than himself. For a moment, nothing else existed. Just this. Just us. But then, just as quickly as it began, he tore himself away. We stood there, panting, stunned, undone. His forehead rested against mine, his hands still gripping me like he wasn't ready to let go. Tell me to stop, he whispered, but his grip tightened. I let out a shaky breath. I should have. I really should have. But I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I whispered, "Don't." The room was silent except for our ragged breaths. My pulse still pounded, but for the first time in weeks, it wasn't from exhaustion or frustration, it was from him. Cole's grip on me was tight, like he wasn't sure whether to pull me closer or push me away. But he hadn't let go. And I wasn't about to move. I swallowed hard, my body still thrumming from the intensity of the kiss. Cole. He silenced me by pressing his forehead against mine, his breath warm against my lips. This is a mistake, he murmured, but his hands on my waist said otherwise. I exhaled shakily. Then why does it feel inevitable? His fingers flexed against me. A muscle in his jaw ticked. I knew he was battling himself, but for once, I wasn't going to let him win. I leaned in again, giving him one last chance to stop this. To stop us. He didn't. Instead, he kissed me again, deeper this time, slower, like he was memorizing every inch of me. His hands traced down my back, hesitant at first, then surer. I gasped as he pulled me closer, our bodies pressed together, heat radiating between us. I had imagined this moment, I just never thought I'd have it, and yet here we were, crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. Cole wasn't just hungry, he was careful, controlled even in his desire. Like he knew how dangerous this was, but had made the decision anyway. My fingers tangled in his shirt, and then it was gone, discarded somewhere on the floor. His skin was warm beneath my hands, muscles taut with restraint. "Are you sure?" he asked, voice rough, edged with something vulnerable. I nodded, but then whispered, "Are you?" He didn't answer. Instead, he showed me. The night unfolded in whispers and touches, in quiet sighs and moments that felt too fragile to exist outside this room. It was intense, yes, but it was also soft, careful in a way I hadn't expected. Cole had always been strong, untouchable, but here, with me, he was something else entirely. He was human, and that was the part that scared me most, because I wasn't sure how long this version of him would last. As the adrenaline faded, I found myself lying beside him, my head on his chest, listening to his steady breathing. The warmth of his body was grounding, but in the back of my mind, doubts crept in. Would he regret this? Would he push me away in the morning, pretend this never happened? I turned my head slightly, my voice barely a whisper. What happens now? For the first time, Cole had no answer. He stared at the ceiling, his fingers tracing absently along my shoulder. I waited, hoping, dreading. But he didn't speak. He just held me tighter, and that was the only answer I got. The morning after felt like waking up from a dream, except the ache in my body and the warmth still lingering on my skin told me it had been real. For a moment lying there in the dim light of dawn, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't a mistake. But then Cole moved. His touch, which had been so sure last night, was gone. His body, which had been pressed against mine for hours, shifted away like he couldn't bear the closeness anymore. I turned my head to look at him. He was already sitting up, the muscles in his back tense, his head down as if he was trying to will away the night before. A cold weight settled in my chest. Cole? My voice was hoarse, tentative. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he exhaled sharply and ran a hand over his face. When he finally spoke, his voice was clipped, all business. You should go. The words cut deeper than they should have. I sat up slowly, searching his face for something, anything, that would tell me last night hadn't just been a reckless mistake, but his expression was unreadable, distant, cold. Just like that. The wall between us was back up, stronger than before. I swallowed hard, my chest tight. Is that all you're going to say? He turned to me then, and for a split second I saw it. The war raging in his eyes. Regret? Guilt? Or something else entirely? But just as quickly, he shut it down. This can't happen again, he muttered, standing up and grabbing his discarded shirt. A hollow feeling spread through me. I had expected this, hadn't I? I had known the risks, the consequences. But that didn't make it hurt any less. I forced a nod, my throat dry. Understood, Sergeant. The second I said it, something flickered across his face, like the title felt wrong between us now. But he didn't stop me when I dressed and left his quarters. He didn't say a damn. Word training was brutal that morning, not because of the drills, not because of the heat, but because Cole wouldn't even look at me. Every order was barked in my direction without an ounce of familiarity. Every glance that should have held something, recognition, acknowledgement, regret, was gone. I told myself it didn't matter, that I could handle this. But then the whispers started. I felt them before I even heard them. The way the air around me shifted, the sidelong glances, the hushed conversations that stopped the second I walked by. Cole had always been tough on us, but now people were noticing just how much attention he had given me, Too much attention. Special treatment, someone muttered as I passed by. I ignored it, until I couldn't. That night, as I sat alone on my bunk, pretending not to care, a shadow loomed over me. I looked up to see Dawson, one of the older recruits, arms crossed over his chest, a knowing smirk playing on his lips. "You've been spending a lot of time with the sergeant," he said casually. My stomach twisted, but I kept my face neutral. "So?" Dawson chuckled, shaking his head. "Relax, I don't care what you do, but others might." I forced myself to hold his gaze. "There's nothing to care about." His smirk widened. "If you say so." He leaned in slightly. "Just be careful, Mark. People start talking when a recruit gets special treatment. And talk, it can be dangerous." He patted my shoulder before walking away, leaving my pulse racing with panic. People were watching, and if we weren't careful, everything would come crashing down. The weight of unspoken words had been suffocating me for days. Cole had pulled away, but I still felt him everywhere, in the stolen glances, in the tension thick enough to cut, in the way my body still ached for his touch. But the fear of exposure had changed everything. He was avoiding me, burying himself in duty, pretending that night had never happened. And maybe I could have endured it if I hadn't seen the truth in his eyes every time he looked at me. He was breaking just like I was. So that night, I made a choice. I wasn't going to let him erase us. I found him alone in his quarters. His back to me as he sat at the small desk, rubbing his temples like the weight of the world rested on his shoulders. I shut the door behind me. Firm. Final. Cole turned at the sound, his expression unreadable, until he saw the look on my face. Then, he sighed. "Mark, you shouldn't be here." I stepped forward. "I don't care." His jaw tightened. "You need to." "No," I shot back, my voice sharp, raw. "What I need is for you to stop pretending like that night meant nothing." Cole inhaled. Sharply, standing up, but I didn't back down. I couldn't. "You pulled me close. You held me. You kissed me like you needed me," I said, my voice shaking with frustration, with need. "And now what? You're just going to pretend it never happened? That I don't exist?" His hands clenched into fists at his sides, his entire body wound tight. "You think this is easy for me?" His voice was low, hoarse, almost broken. I swallowed. "Then why are you making it harder?" Silence. He exhaled sharply, turning away for a moment like he needed to gather himself. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter. "This isn't just about us," he muttered. "You know what happens if we get caught?" "Yeah," I admitted. "I do." I took another step toward him, my heart hammering. "But I also know what happens if we walk away." He finally turned back to me, and for the first time in days, his guard cracked. His eyes, so guarded, so conflicted, held something raw, something unspoken but screaming between us. "I've never—" He hesitated, struggling, then exhaled, sharply. "I've never felt this before." His confession sent something sharp through my chest, and suddenly I saw it all. The war he was fighting, the weight he was carrying. I stepped closer, my voice softer now. "Then don't let it go." His eyes searched mine, like he was drowning and trying to decide whether to reach for me or let himself sink. "Mark." I shook my head. "We can figure this out together, but don't push me away." The air between us crackled. For a moment I thought he would walk away, that he'd choose duty over whatever this was. But then, he moved. He closed the distance in one breathless second, gripping my face in his hands, and then his lips were on mine. Deep. Desperate, like he was pouring every unspoken word into me. I gasped into his mouth, my hands fisting in his shirt as he held on like he was afraid to let go. This wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. When we finally broke apart, he rested his forehead against mine, his breathing ragged. "We'll keep it quiet," he murmured. "But it's real." I nodded, my chest tight with something that felt a hell of a lot like hope. I didn't need promises. I just needed him. And for now, That was enough. Months had passed, yet nothing between us had faded. The stolen moments, the whispered words in the dead of night, the brief brushes of fingers when no one was looking, it all meant more than words ever could. We had learned to navigate this life in secrecy, to exist in the spaces between duty and desire. The world saw us as nothing more than soldier and sergeant, but in the quiet moments, away from prying eyes, we were so much more. When the nights got hard, when the weight of hiding felt too heavy, Cole would find me. A brief touch on my back as he walked by, a lingering glance across the training field, silent reminders that I wasn't alone. One night, as we lay in the dark, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on my skin, he whispered, "One day we won't have to hide." I turned to face him, my heart pounding. "Promise?" His lips pressed against mine, soft, sure. "Promise." The next morning, as we passed each other in the hall, our eyes met. One final stolen glance, filled with love. With hope, because some loves are worth waiting for, and ours was worth fighting for.